What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the Waylanders. Now, with this being a recent release, I'm going to cut to the chase a little bit and give you guys a TLDR. We are going to cover everything I normally cover in these reviews, but just to be upfront with you guys, I, right now, simply would not buy this game. Its release version is incredibly buggy, especially like the last half or so, which is, unsurprisingly, the part that wasn't in its early access state, but you combine that with the fact that the early access builds were, in some cases, just straight up more stable, along with the fact that some of the promised update stuff for the launch just is not here, which is ultimately culminated in a fairly disappointing launch, because the game itself holds some promise. I was actually looking forward to it myself, and we are still going to go over all this stuff, of course. Again, recent release, just wanted to be upfront with you guys so you don't have to sit through this whole video for me to tell you that the game just isn't in what I would consider a state worth playing for, and hopefully a few months down the line they'll have it sorted out. But right now, it's just not there. Now, if this happens to be the first video of mine you're watching, typically I like to review games after I 100% them, which in this particular case was a very difficult thing to do and took much longer than I was anticipating because of all the bugs. But nonetheless, it is done, and everything I cover in these reviews, you can go over in a video that is the front page of my YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed, there will be a video explaining all of it. And it does include more than just the achievements, of course. But from here, let's dive in a little bit. First up, let's talk about the story of the Waylanders, or at least the setup. Obviously, I'm not going to spoil as much of this as possible, but the setup for the story. Essentially, you are part of a group of Celtic people who go to the island of Ireland to meet their gods. It goes south, and the timeline somehow becomes corrupted, and the story revolves around that, with the later part of the game shifting you to the medieval era and out of the Celtic era. And while overall I think that's an interesting enough premise for a game, it unfortunately falls flat in a few places. For starters, while this game was in early access, we were told that some of the missing parts of the prologue, etc., where the game would just kind of jump around and not explain things super well, would be filled in for launch. However, that never happened. Just playing the game through the prologue and getting the setup, key moments of information just get skipped. And suddenly you have this whole other situation going on, and it's very jarring. And while that does clear up a little bit in the later game where things start getting explained a little better, it's very off-putting for the beginning of the game to have it just jump around. And again, I was under the impression that this was going to be elaborated upon for the launch version of the game, which is what the early access period certainly implied. But unfortunately, it's not here. Now, moving on to character creation. On the good side of things, the races, the classes, and the origin stories I thought were pretty neat. You don't actually get to play out the origin stories really, but they kind of help define your character a little bit by where they came from in life, which was nice. The races are basically human, werewolf, Morian, or semi-Fomorian, which is like a Cyclops race. And beyond that, there are a bunch of classes to choose from, which can kind of help your play style. Now, unfortunately, there's kind of a lack of cosmetic options, some of which are even bugged and just are the same options as other options. But like a lot of this game, the core concept is there, but the execution is a little spotty. Now, beyond that, once you hit level 9 in your character progression, you'll actually unlock an advanced class. I liked the advanced classes. They're pretty cool. They will typically only add a couple of abilities to the class you've already chosen. You'll get a choice of 3 of them per class. And they just add a little extra flavor to what you were already doing, and I actually enjoyed it a lot. They mesh with the rest of the game pretty well. Now, before we wrap up the character creation part of this, I did want to mention that as early as character creation, you can start seeing abilities and things that are missing their text string, meaning that some stuff just doesn't get explained, and this is a problem that is primarily seen later in the game, especially with the advanced classes, where some of the abilities just don't tell you what they do or anything because the text is missing. Now, in terms of difficulty, we have Peasant to Nightmare. Peasant makes you unkillable, like your characters can't die in combat, so every situation is pretty easy as a result because you can't die. And then on higher difficulties, it does ramp up a little bit. You need to have a bit more understanding of what items you should be using, such as consumables, etc., how to heal, the formation system, and how that works in combat. But overall, the difficulty is pretty varied, and you should be able to find something that works for you. And from there, let's talk a little bit about world building. The game takes place in 2 settings, as I mentioned, Celtic and medieval. After a certain point in the game, you'll be able to fast travel between these 2 ages. And just normally, you'll be fast traveling between various maps in a sort of Dragon Age Origins CRPG style fashion where you just kind of use a world map to travel around to set locations, etc. And overall, I actually did think this part of the game was well done, the world building and the visual direction. It's really cool to see how everything looks in the Celtic area and then jump forward to the medieval era where ideologies and things have changed. Magic goes from being widely available to shunned and is leaving the world, etc. And it's cool to float back and forth and just kind of see those things take place. And I enjoyed that part of it a lot. Now, I will say the art style is definitely not for everybody, but I would say the visual direction is probably one of the best things this game has going for it. Because in terms of just the world, I think it's gorgeous. I'm a big fan of the art style. It is nonetheless admittedly a little cartoony and again, not to everybody's taste, but I enjoyed it a lot. But beyond that, in terms of world building, you'll be kind of learning about some of the races and stuff unique to this world, what's going on with the werewolves, why they're not like full-blown werewolves anymore, that type of stuff. There's some interesting things around what's happened to the goblins in between the Celtic and medieval era. So there's just kind of some cool stuff to dive into there if you look for it. Now beyond that, let's talk about combat. So combat is a third-person, real-time with pause system. If you've ever played Dragon Age Origins, you kind of get the gist of what they were going for. However, it is much simpler in its execution. Every character is eventually going to get access to every one of their active skills, meaning you're not really making any decisions with your class outside of when to pick up what ability, but you will eventually get them all. Now, I do like the advanced classes because you get to make a choice which will kind of change the abilities and adds a little extra flavor. But truthfully, overall, the combat gets pretty simple a little ways into the game, especially once you've figured out what consumables to use when, etc. But beyond that, the really interesting thing about combat to me was the formation system. Basically, you can take 3 of your characters, and depending on the lead character's class, they'll have access to a couple different formations, which turn that group of characters into its own separate unit with its own separate abilities, and overall it can kind of add a fun variance to the combat that I enjoyed a lot. I would say later game it's honestly not even super necessary to use it, but early game it can be very fun to mess around with. Now let's talk a bit about the companions. Now you'll get 9 companions, but truthfully it's a little hard to describe them, because as time shifts, so do they. You'll get your 9 companions in the Celtic era, but then when you go to the medieval era, some of them have been reincarnated into different people with honestly fairly different personalities, which again just makes it hard to describe the companions super well. Several of them are romanceable depending on how you approach their personal quests, but the romances themselves are usually just a sex scene and then a little bit of dialogue that you can have with the character on your ship, but that seems to pretty much be the extent of it, which isn't bad. That's honestly basically what it is for a lot of games, but just something to keep in mind there. Beyond that, the companions have a pretty good mix of classes, but overall, I think they could stand to be fleshed out a little more. Ultimately, each companion gets a few loyalty missions, if you will, some of which are actually kind of required to progress the story. But overall, it just feels like your relationship with these people is accelerating very, very quickly, just kind of because of the way the game is paced. But beyond that stuff, let's kind of wrap this up a little bit with some positives and some negatives. So positives, the core concepts for the game are there. There's a lot of things I like about this game. I just wish that they were executed a little bit better, frankly. There are times when combat feels super clunky and it feels like you can't target things. But if you can get past that stuff and the annoying bugs, the core concepts of the game are pretty good. And I'm hoping with some time, maybe they can bring this game up to speed. Beyond that, the art direction is really great. Again, I actually love the visual style they went with here. But let's talk negatives. So obviously the bugs. There's way too many of them. This feels like an early access title. It genuinely feels worse than the early access builds, which is just an unacceptable way to release a game. You combine that with the parts of the story that just feel like they're missing, which we were told would be added in later, and you have yet more disappointment. Moreover, the dialogue for the characters is real weird. So they kind of went with like modern language for a lot of the characters, which juxtaposed against the setting, it just feels very odd. Like you'll have characters cursing and telling you how charming they are and calling each other names that, people back then wouldn't use. It just seems a little bit odd. And while I suspect some people won't care, I genuinely found it a little jarring. But to draw a conclusion here, just like I told you at the beginning of the video, do not buy this game right now. Just straight up. It is not worth the money. You will have a very difficult time just completing the game. It took me a lot longer than this review should have because I, needed to complete the game. And hopefully in like 6 months or so, we might be able to revisit this and give an update. But right now, the title just isn't there. I would not spend my money on this, frankly. But of course, I already have actually spent my money on this one. I did not get this for free. I did actually pay for it. But nonetheless, there you guys go. Unfortunately, a bit on the negative side, which isn't something I like to hammer home, but frankly, this game should not have been released the way it was, and it's unfortunate to see it. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did or you found it useful, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But in the meantime, may you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.